Standing in front of the United Nations headquarters in New York, holding an achievement award from the Secretary General himself, I couldn't help but think about my brother Marcus rolling his eyes just 6 months earlier, telling me I was wasting my time on another one of my useless projects. My parents had sided with him, of course. They always did. But here I was, representing not just my small organization, but an entire movement that had already changed thousands of lives across 3 states. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Rebecca Sullivan, and this story begins in the summer of 2019 in Millfield, Ohio, a town so small that everyone knew your business before you did. I was 24, fresh out of college with a degree in social work that my family considered about as valuable as a participation trophy. While my older brother Marcus was climbing the corporate ladder at a prestigious accounting firm in Columbus, I was living in my childhood bedroom, trying to figure out how to turn my passion for helping people into something that could actually make a difference. The idea came to me during one of those sweltering July afternoons when the air conditioning had given up and everyone in town was moving like they were underwater. I was volunteering at the local food bank, something I'd been doing since high school, when Mrs. Chen, the elderly director, mentioned they were throwing away dozens of perfectly good meals every week because they couldn't find enough volunteers to deliver them to homebound seniors. "It's heartbreaking," she said, wiping sweat from her forehead as we sorted through donations. "We have Mrs. Patterson on Elm Street, who hasn't had a hot meal in weeks because her arthritis is too bad for her to cook. And Mr. Rodriguez lives alone since his wife passed. He barely eats at all anymore. But we only have 3 regular drivers, and they can't cover everyone." That night, lying on my childhood bed with its faded purple comforter and posters of bands I'd outgrown years ago, I couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Rodriguez. I started sketching out ideas in an old notebook, trying to figure out how to connect the dots between abundance and need. By sunrise, I had the basic framework for what would eventually become Bridge the Gap, a volunteer network that wouldn't just deliver food, but would create ongoing relationships between volunteers and isolated community members. The concept was simple. Instead of random food deliveries, we'd pair volunteers with specific individuals for regular visits. The volunteers would bring meals, but more importantly, they'd provide companionship, help with small tasks, and serve as a connection point for other services the person might need. It wasn't just about feeding people. It was about rebuilding the community connections that had been lost as families spread out and neighborhoods became collections of strangers. I spent the next 2 weeks researching everything I could find about food insecurity, social isolation among seniors, and volunteer coordination. I reached out to professors from college, read academic papers until my eyes burned, and called other nonprofits across the state to learn from their experiences. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that this could work. The first person I told was my roommate from college, Sarah Martinez, who was working at a nonprofit in Cleveland. She loved the idea immediately and offered to help me write grant applications and set up the legal paperwork. The second person I told was my family. I chose a Sunday dinner for the announcement, thinking the familiar setting of Mom's dining room would make them more receptive. Dad was carving the roast beef, Mom was passing around her famous mashed potatoes, and Marcus was scrolling through his phone while complaining about his latest client. It felt like the perfect moment to share, something I was genuinely excited about. "So I've been working on this idea," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's a volunteer program that would connect people who need help with community members who want to help. We'd start with meal delivery and companionship for seniors, but eventually it could expand to include transportation, light home repairs, technology help, basically creating a support network for anyone who's fallen through the cracks." Dad set down the carving knife and gave me his full attention, which was encouraging. Mom smiled in that way that could mean either genuine interest or polite tolerance. Marcus didn't look up from his phone. That sounds lovely, honey, Mom said. But how would you find something like that? And where would you find the time to manage it all? I've been researching grants, and there's actually quite a bit of funding available for community-based programs like this. Plus, I'm thinking of applying for some fellowship programs that would provide startup money and mentorship. As for time, this is what I want to do with my life. I want to make this my career. That's when Marcus finally looked up. Your career? Becca, you can't make a living running some feel-good volunteer thing. You need a real job with real benefits and a real salary. This sounds like something you do on weekends, not something you build your whole life around. Marcus is right, Dad chimed in, though his tone was gentler. It's admirable that you want to help people, but you also need to think practically. Maybe you could do this as a side project while you look for a position with an established organization. I felt my cheeks burning, but I pressed on. This isn't just a hobby or a side project. I've done the research, and there's a real need for this kind of program. The senior center alone has a waiting list of over 50 people who need regular check-ins. The food bank is wasting resources because they can't coordinate deliveries effectively. And there are tons of people in town who want to help but don't know how to get involved. This could actually work. Sweetie, Mom said, using the tone she'd used when I was 7 and wanted to be a veterinarian for dolphins. You have such a big heart, and that's wonderful. But starting a nonprofit is incredibly difficult. Most of them fail within the first few years. Maybe you should get some experience working for someone else's organization first? Marcus was nodding along. Exactly. And even if it doesn't fail completely, you'll probably end up working 60-hour weeks for less money than you'd make managing a McDonald's. Is that really what you want? The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with my family, gently but persistently steering me away from what they saw as an impractical dream. They weren't being cruel. They genuinely thought they were protecting me from disappointment and financial hardship. But with every realistic alternative they suggested, I felt more determined to prove them wrong. 2 days later, I was back. At the food bank, helping Mrs. Chen sort through a delivery of slightly dented canned goods that a local grocery store had donated. I told her about my family's reaction, and she listened while she organized green beans by expiration date. You know, she said finally, when I started this food bank 30 years ago, my husband thought I was crazy. He said nobody would donate to some woman running a charity out of her garage. Now we serve over 800 families a month. She paused to check the date on a can of corn. Sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who have the hardest time seeing us do something different. They worry because they care, but that doesn't mean they're right. That conversation gave me the push I needed. I spent the rest of July writing my first grant application, staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning researching funding opportunities and crafting program descriptions. Sarah helped me navigate the legal requirements for establishing a nonprofit, and by August, I had submitted paperwork to become an official 501c3 organization. The first grant I applied for was through the Ohio Community Foundation, a modest $5,000 to fund a 6-month pilot program. I proposed starting with 10 volunteer client pairs, providing weekly visits that would include meal delivery, companionship, and basic needs assessment. The application required detailed budgets, program timelines, and evaluation metrics. IMB spent weeks perfecting every section, knowing this could be my only shot at getting the program off the ground. While I waited for the grant decision, I started building the foundation for the program. I partnered with the food bank and the senior center to identify potential clients, reaching out to people who had expressed interest in receiving regular visits. Mrs. Patterson, the woman Mrs. Chen had mentioned, was one of the first to sign up. She was 78, lived alone in a small house on Elm Street, and hadn't had a meaningful conversation with another person in weeks. I also started recruiting volunteers through social media, church bulletins, and word of mouth. The response was better than I'd expected. Apparently, there were a lot of people in Millfield who wanted to help their neighbors, but hadn't known how to get started. Jenny Brooks, a retired teacher, was one of the first to volunteer. She'd been looking for ways to stay active and connected to her community since retiring the previous year. In September, I got the call I'd been hoping for. The Ohio Community Foundation had approved my grant application. $5,000 might not sound like much, but it was enough to cover basic program costs for 6 months: insurance, background checks for volunteers, a simple database, system to track visits, and small stipends for gas and supplies. My family's reaction to the news was mixed. Mom and Dad congratulated me, but I could tell they were still skeptical about the long-term viability of the project. Marcus was more direct in his doubt. "Okay, so you got some money to play nonprofit for a few months," he said when I called to share the news. "But what happens when that runs out? Have you thought about what you're going to do for health insurance? Or retirement savings? You can't live with Mom and Dad forever." His questions stung because they echoed my own worries. But I was determined to make the program work, not just for the people we'd be helping, but to prove that I could build something meaningful and sustainable. The official launch of Bridge. The Gap was scheduled for October 15, 2019. I'd spent weeks training the initial group of 12 volunteers, matching them with clients based on personality, location, and specific needs. Jenny Brooks was paired with Mrs. Patterson, and their first meeting exceeded all my expectations. "She's not just bringing me meals," Mrs. Patterson told me during a follow-up call. "Yesterday, she helped me organize my medications, and next week, she's going to show me how to use that tablet my grandson gave me. I haven't felt this connected to the world in months." Similar feedback came from other client volunteer pairs. Mr. Rodriguez, the widower Mrs. Chen had mentioned, was paired with Tom Walsh, a recently retired mechanic who'd been looking for ways to stay busy. Not only were they having regular meals together, but Tom had started helping Mr. Rodriguez with small home repairs and yard work. Within 6 weeks of launching, word about the program had spread beyond our initial group. I was getting calls from seniors who wanted to be matched with volunteers, volunteers who wanted to help more than one person, and even family members of seniors in other towns who wondered if we could expand our service area. The success was exciting, but it also created new challenges: coordinating schedules, conducting background checks, training new volunteers, and managing the growing database was becoming more than I could handle alone. I was working 12-hour days, 7 days a week, trying to keep up with demand while also documenting outcomes for grant reports and planning for the program's future. That's when I made the decision that would ultimately change everything, though I didn't know it at the time. Instead of trying to manage everything myself, I started recruiting other young professionals who shared my vision for community-driven social change. Lisa Kim, a recent graduate with a degree in nonprofit management, joined as a volunteer coordinator. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. David Thompson, who had experience in social work, took over client intake and assessment. By December, we weren't just a meal delivery program anymore. We'd evolved into a comprehensive community support network. Volunteers were helping clients with grocery shopping, transportation to medical appointments, technology, support, and basic home maintenance. We'd served over 60 people across 3 counties, and our volunteer base had grown to 45 active participants. The transformation was remarkable, but it was also invisible to most people outside our immediate community. To my family, it still looked like I was playing at running a charity while living in my childhood bedroom and surviving on grant money that could disappear at any moment. They weren't wrong about the financial uncertainty, but they couldn't see the foundation we were building for something much larger than any of us had initially imagined. The new year brought unexpected opportunities. Dr. Amanda Foster, a professor of social policy at Ohio State University, had heard about Bridge the Gap through one of her graduate students who lived in our service area. She reached out in January 2020, interested in conducting a research study on our program's effectiveness in reducing social isolation among seniors. What you've built is exactly the kind of community-based intervention we need more data on, she explained during our first phone call. Would you be open to participating in a formal evaluation? It would involve some additional paperwork and interviews, but the results could help you secure larger grants and potentially expand to other communities. The timing couldn't have been better. Our initial grant was scheduled to run out in April, and while I'd applied for several follow-up grants, none had been approved yet. Having university research backing our program would add credibility that might make the difference in future applications. Dr. Foster's team began collecting baseline data in February, interviewing our clients about their mental health, social connections, and overall quality of life. They also surveyed our volunteers about their motivations and experiences. The preliminary findings were even stronger than I'd hoped. Clients showed measurable improvements in depression scores, increased social interaction, and better adherence to medical treatments. Volunteers reported higher levels of community, connection, and personal satisfaction. But just as things were gaining momentum, the world changed. COVID-19 hit Ohio in March, and suddenly, everything we'd built seemed impossible to continue. Social distancing guidelines meant our volunteers couldn't make their regular visits, and many of our clients, elderly and vulnerable, were completely isolated. My family saw this as confirmation of their worst fears about my career choice. This is exactly what we were worried about, Marcus said during a family video call in late March. You've put all your eggs in one basket, and now the basket's gone. At least if you had a regular job, you'd have unemployment benefits or something. Instead of giving up, we pivoted. Within 2 weeks, Lisa, David, and I had redesigned the entire program for pandemic conditions. We organized contactless food deliveries, set up video calling systems for clients who had smartphones or tablets, and created porch visits, where volunteers could check on clients from a safe distance. For clients without technology, we arranged daily phone calls and letter-writing campaigns. The adaptation actually strengthened many of our relationships. Jenny Brooks started having hour-long video calls with Mrs. Patterson every morning, teaching her to use various apps and helping her reconnect with distant family members. Tom Walsh began a small home repair business specifically for seniors who couldn't safely have strangers in their homes, focusing on outdoor projects and emergency fixes. By summer 2020, we'd not only maintained our client base but expanded it. News about our pandemic adaptation spread through social work networks, and I started receiving calls from organizations in other states wanting to replicate our model. The Ohio Department of Aging invited me to present at their annual conference, and several foundations reached out about larger funding opportunities. That's when I made my first major mistake. Excited by the attention and convinced that rapid expansion was the path to long-term sustainability, I applied for a $50,000 federal grant that would allow us to serve 5 additional counties. The application required detailed staffing plans, administrative systems, and evaluation protocols that were far beyond our current capacity. I spent 3 months crafting what I thought was a perfect application, working 16-hour days and neglecting the day-to-day operations that had made our program successful in the first place. When the rejection letter arrived in September, it felt like a personal failure. The feedback was polite but clear. Our organizational infrastructure wasn't mature enough to handle that level of expansion. Maybe this is a sign that you should consider other options, Dad suggested gently when I called home in tears. You've done amazing work, but perhaps it's time to think about using this experience to get a position with a larger, more established organization. The suggestion made sense on paper, but it felt like abandoning everyone who'd come to depend on our program. Instead of scaling back, I decided to focus on deepening our impact in the communities we already served. I applied for smaller, more targeted grants and began developing partnerships with local healthcare systems and social service agencies. The breakthrough came in November 2020 when Dr. Foster published her preliminary research findings in the Journal of Community Health. The article, titled Community-Driven Solutions to Senior Isolation, a Case Study in Rural Ohio, highlighted Bridge the Gap as a model for cost-effective, scalable intervention. Within days of publication, my inbox was flooded with messages from researchers, policymakers, and nonprofit leaders across the country. One of those messages was from Dr. James Mitchell, a senior advisor to the UN's Department of Economic and Social Affairs. He was working on a global initiative to address aging populations and social isolation, and he wanted to learn more about our approach. We scheduled a video call for the following week. "What strikes me about your model," Dr. Mitchell said during our conversation, "is how you've created sustainable relationships rather than transactional services. Most programs focus on delivering specific services: meals, transportation, health checks. But you've built a system that addresses the underlying issue of social disconnection." He explained that the UN was developing a global framework for community-based aging support, drawing on successful programs from around the world. They were particularly interested in models that could be adapted to different cultural contexts while maintaining their core effectiveness. "Would you be interested in participating in our international working group?" he asked. "We're bringing together program leaders from 12 countries to develop best practices and policy recommendations. It would involve some travel to New York and potentially other countries, plus ongoing collaboration over the next 18 months. I nearly dropped my phone. 6 months earlier, my brother had been questioning whether my charity project was worth pursuing, and now I was being invited to contribute to global policy development at the United Nations. The working group's first meeting was scheduled for January 2021 in New York. I'd never been to the UN headquarters, never been part of an international policy discussion, never even presented to an audience larger than 50 people. But I knew this was the opportunity that could transform not just my program, but my entire approach to social change. My family's reaction to the UN invitation was mixed. Mom and Dad were proud but worried about the travel and time commitment. Marcus remained skeptical. "It sounds impressive," he admitted. "But are they paying you for this? And what happens to your program in Ohio while you're flying around the world having meetings?" His questions were valid, but they missed the bigger picture. This wasn't just about recognition or travel. It was about learning from other programs, accessing resources we could never find locally, and potentially influencing policies that could help millions of isolated seniors worldwide. The first UN meeting exceeded all my expectations. I found myself sitting around a conference table with program leaders from Kenya, Sweden, Japan, Brazil, and 8 other countries, sharing strategies for addressing social isolation among aging populations. Despite our different languages and cultural contexts, the challenges were remarkably similar, and the solutions we'd developed often complemented each other perfectly. Dr. Sarah Lindberg from Sweden had created an intergenerational housing program that paired seniors with university students. Maria Santos from Brazil had developed a mobile health clinic that provided both medical care and social connection in rural communities. Takeshi Yamamoto from Japan had built a volunteer network that used traditional crafts and storytelling to bridge generational gaps. Over 3 days of intensive workshops, we began developing a comprehensive framework that could be adapted to different cultural and economic contexts. My contribution focused on volunteer recruitment, training, and retention, areas where our Ohio program had developed particularly effective strategies. By the end of the meeting, we'd committed to implementing pilot programs in each of our countries, sharing data and best practices, and presenting our collective findings at the UN's next Global Forum on Aging. The timeline was ambitious. We had 18 months to demonstrate measurable impact and develop policy recommendations for member nations. Flying back to Ohio, I felt a mixture of excitement and terror. The opportunity was incredible, but it also meant expanding our program in ways I'd never imagined. We'd need better data collection systems, more sophisticated evaluation methods, and probably additional staff to handle the increased complexity. When I got home and told my family about the meetings and our next steps, their response was different than I'd expected. Instead of skepticism, I saw genuine curiosity and even a hint of pride. "So the United Nations thinks your little charity program is worth studying?" Marcus asked, and for the first time in months, his tone wasn't dismissive. "It's not just studying," I explained. "We're going to be part of developing international policies that could affect how countries support their aging populations, and our program is going to be expanded and evaluated as part of a global research initiative. For the first time since I'd started Bridge the Gap, my family seemed to understand that this wasn't just a local volunteer project. It was becoming something much larger, something that could have an impact far beyond the borders of Millfield, Ohio. The spring of 2021 brought challenges I hadn't anticipated. Implementing the UN pilot program while maintaining our existing operations in Ohio required resources we simply didn't have. The International Working Group had provided a modest stipend for research activities, but it wasn't enough to hire additional staff or upgrade our technology systems to handle the sophisticated data collection requirements. That's when Lisa suggested something that initially made me uncomfortable: charging fees for our consultation services. Other nonprofits and government agencies were increasingly reaching out for guidance on replicating our model, and Lisa argued we should start treating these as revenue-generating opportunities rather than free favors. "Rebecca, you spend 10 hours a week on calls with organizations that want to copy what we've built," she pointed out during one of our staff meetings. "Meanwhile, we're struggling to pay for basic program expenses. We could charge consulting fees and use that income to strengthen our core operations." The idea felt wrong at first. Bridge the Gap had always been about freely sharing resources and supporting community-driven solutions. But Lisa was right. We were providing valuable expertise that other organizations were willing to pay for, and that income could help us serve more people in Ohio while contributing to the global research initiative. Our first consulting contract was with the Colorado Department of Health, which wanted to pilot our volunteer matching system in 3 rural counties. The $15,000 fee seemed enormous at the time, but the project taught me how much work was really involved in adapting our model to different contexts. Colorado's rural communities faced unique challenges: greater geographic distances, different demographic patterns, and distinct cultural attitudes toward accepting help. Working with the Colorado team forced us to document and systematize aspects of our program that had previously existed only in our heads. We created detailed training manuals, evaluation protocols, and implementation guides that became the foundation for future consulting work. More importantly, the Colorado pilot generated data that strengthened our contribution to the UN research initiative. By summer 2021, we were juggling consulting projects in 4 states while expanding our Ohio operations to include 3 new counties. The growth was exciting, but overwhelming. I was working 18-hour days, traveling constantly, and barely keeping up with the administrative demands of our various projects. My family noticed the change in my stress levels during a July barbecue at my parents' house. I spent most of the afternoon on my laptop, frantically trying to finish a report for the UN Working Group while simultaneously responding to emails from our Colorado partners. "You look exhausted," Mom observed, as she handed me a plate of grilled chicken. "Are you sure you're not taking on too much?" "This is just a busy period," I insisted, though even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. The success of our program had created opportunities, but it had also created pressures I wasn't sure how to manage. Marcus, who had been quietly observing my frantic multitasking, made a suggestion that surprised me. "Have you thought about bringing in a business manager or something? You're good at the program stuff, but all this administrative and financial management seems like it's burning you out." It was the first time he'd offered constructive advice about my work rather than questioning its viability. More importantly, he was right. I needed help with the aspects of organizational growth that weren't my strengths. That conversation led me to hire Michelle Rodriguez, an MBA with nonprofit management experience, as our operations director. Michelle took over financial management, contract negotiations, and administrative systems, freeing me to focus on program development and the UN collaboration. The change was transformative. Within 3 months, we'd streamlined our operations, improved our financial tracking, and developed more systematic approaches to expansion. Michelle also helped me understand something I'd been resistant to acknowledge. We were no longer a small community organization. We'd evolved into a mid-sized nonprofit with complex operations and significant responsibilities. This realization became crucial when Dr. Mitchell contacted me in October with unexpected news. The UN's Global Forum on Aging had been moved up by 6 months, and our working group was being asked to present our preliminary findings in March 2022 rather than September. More significantly, the Secretary General's office was planning to announce a new global initiative on aging and social isolation, using our collective research as the foundation for policy recommendations. Rebecca, I need you to understand what this means, Dr. Mitchell explained during our call. Your program isn't just going to be featured in academic research anymore. It's going to be held up as a model for member nations to consider adopting. The visibility will be enormous, but so will the scrutiny. The opportunity was thrilling and terrifying. Having our work recognized at the highest levels of international policy was beyond anything I'd imagined when I started Bridge the Gap. But it also meant that any weaknesses in our model or failures in our outcomes would be exposed on a global stage. I spent the next 4 months preparing with an intensity that worried everyone around me. We conducted additional evaluations of our Ohio programs, gathered more detailed data from our consulting projects, and developed comprehensive documentation of our methods and outcomes. I practiced my presentation dozens of times, worked with professional designers to create compelling visual materials, and collaborated with the other working group members to ensure our collective presentation was cohesive and compelling. My family's attitude toward my work continued to evolve during this period. Dad started reading the academic articles that featured our program, asking thoughtful questions about our methodology and outcomes. Mom began telling her friends about my UN work with obvious pride. Even Marcus showed genuine interest in our financial sustainability and growth strategies. I have to admit, he said during a February phone call, I didn't think this would go anywhere when you started, but you've built something real. I mean, the United Nations doesn't invite just anyone to help write international policy recommendations. The March 2022 Global Forum on Aging was held at UN headquarters in New York, with representatives from 150 member nations in attendance. Our working group's presentation was scheduled for the forum's second day in the main General Assembly Hall. Walking into that space, where world leaders had made historic speeches and crucial decisions, felt surreal. Our presentation went better than I'd dared to hope. The audience was engaged, asking thoughtful questions about implementation challenges, cost-effectiveness, and cultural adaptation strategies. Several delegations approached us afterward, expressing interest in piloting our approaches in their countries. But the real surprise came during the forum's closing ceremony. Secretary General Antonio Guterres announced the launch of the Global Initiative for Age-Friendly Communities, a comprehensive framework for supporting aging populations worldwide. As he outlined the initiative's core principles, I recognized elements drawn directly from our working group's recommendations. Then he said something that made my heart stop. This initiative builds on the innovative work of community organizations around the world who have demonstrated that effective solutions to social isolation don't require massive government programs or expensive technology. They require human connection, local knowledge, and sustained commitment to treating our elders with dignity and respect. He went on to announce that the UN would be recognizing several organizations whose work had been instrumental in developing the new initiative. When he called my name and asked me to join him on stage, I felt like I was floating. Standing next to the Secretary General as he presented me with the UN Achievement Award for Community Innovation, I thought about that family dinner 3 years earlier when I'd first shared my idea for Bridge the Gap. I thought about Marcus, rolling his eyes, about my parents' gentle skepticism, about all the moments when I'd questioned whether I was wasting my time on something that would never make a real difference. The award ceremony was broadcast globally, and the coverage mentioned not just Bridge the Gap but also our expansion work and consulting services. Within hours of the ceremony, my phone was ringing with interview requests from journalists, collaboration offers from international organizations, and congratulations from people I hadn't spoken to in years. That evening, as I sat in my hotel room, looking at the Crystal Award that represented everything our team had accomplished, I called my family. For the first time in 3 years, no one questioned whether my charity work was worth. The aftermath of the UN award brought opportunities I never could have anticipated, but also challenges that tested everything I thought I knew about running an organization. Within weeks of the ceremony, Bridge the Gap was fielding requests from government agencies in 12 countries, major foundations were offering substantial grants, and my calendar was booked solid with speaking engagements and media interviews. Saipa. First major decision I faced was whether to accept a $2.3 million grant from the MacArthur Foundation to expand our model to 50 cities across North America. The grant would fund a 3-year initiative to establish Bridge the Gap programs in urban, suburban, and rural communities, with comprehensive evaluation and documentation of outcomes. This is exactly what we've been working toward, Lisa argued, during our staff meeting. We finally have the resources to demonstrate impact at scale and prove that community-driven solutions can work everywhere. Michelle was more cautious. The grant is incredible, but it would require us to grow from a team of 8 to over 40 people within 18 months. We'd need new systems, new leadership structures, and a completely different approach to quality control. Are we ready for that kind of transformation? I spent 2 weeks wrestling with the decision. The grant represented validation and opportunity beyond my wildest dreams, but it also meant fundamentally changing the organization I'd built. We'd go from knowing every volunteer and client personally to managing programs we might never visit. We'd trade intimacy and local knowledge for reach and influence. The conversation that ultimately helped me decide came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, our very first client, called me directly, something she'd never done before. "Rebecca, dear, I've been watching you on the news, and I'm so proud of what you've accomplished," she said. "But I wanted to ask you something. All this expansion and international work, does it mean you won't have time for people like me anymore?" Her question cut to the heart of my dilemma. The reason Bridge the Gap worked was because it prioritized relationships over transactions, local knowledge over standardized procedures. How could we maintain that essence while growing to serve hundreds of thousands of people? I decided to accept the MacArthur grant, but with conditions that protected our core values. Instead of creating 50 identical programs, we'd establish 15 regional hubs, each adapted to local contexts and needs. Each hub would have significant autonomy in program design, while adhering to our fundamental principles of relationship building and community ownership. The expansion process taught me lessons about leadership I hadn't learned in any classroom or workshop. Hiring and training hub directors required finding people who shared our values, but also had the skills to adapt our model to completely different communities. The hub director in Phoenix had to address the unique challenges of serving seniors in a desert climate with extreme summer heat. The director in Portland worked with a population that included significant numbers of immigrants and refugees who needed culturally sensitive approaches. Each hub faced different obstacles, but they also developed innovations that strengthened our overall model. The Detroit hub created a job training component that helped unemployed volunteers develop skills while serving their community. The rural Montana hub developed mobile outreach strategies that could reach isolated seniors across vast geographic areas. The Miami hub pioneered bilingual programming that better served the area's diverse Latino population. By late 2022, we were serving over 12,000 seniors across 15 states and provinces, with a volunteer network of nearly 8,000 active participants. The scale was staggering, but more importantly, the evaluation data showed that we'd maintained the quality and effectiveness that had made our original Ohio program successful. This success attracted attention from even more unexpected quarters. In January 2023, I received a call from Dr. Elena Komnenos, a policy advisor to the European Union's Commissioner for Demographics and Democracy. The EU was developing a continent-wide strategy for addressing population aging, and they wanted to explore adapting our model for European contexts. The demographic challenges facing Europe are unprecedented, Dr. Komnenos explained during our initial video conference. We have aging populations, declining birth rates, and increasing social isolation across 27 member states. Traditional government programs aren't scaling effectively, but community-based approaches like yours show real promise. The EU pilot program would be our most ambitious international expansion yet, establishing Bridge the Gap programs in 6 European cities over 2 years, with each program adapted to local languages, cultures, and social service systems. The contract was worth $1.8 million and would require me to spend significant time in Europe, working directly with local partners in Rome, Stockholm, Prague, Lisbon, Krakow, and Dublin. My family's reaction to the EU opportunity reflected how much their perspective had changed since those early days of skepticism. Instead of questioning the viability of international expansion, they were concerned about my personal well-being and work-life balance. "I'm proud of what you've built," Dad said during one of our Sunday phone calls, "but I worry that you're taking on more than any one person can handle. When was the last time you took a real vacation or spent a weekend without working?" He wasn't wrong. The success of Bridge the Gap had consumed my life in ways that weren't sustainable. I was traveling constantly, working 12-hour days even when I was home, and hadn't maintained meaningful personal relationships outside of work colleagues and family. That conversation prompted me to make another crucial decision about organizational structure. Instead of trying to personally oversee every aspect of our expansion, I promoted Lisa to executive director, handling day-to-day operations and domestic programs. I took the title of international director, focusing specifically on global partnerships and policy development. Michelle became our chief operating officer, managing the financial and administrative systems that kept everything running smoothly. This restructuring allowed me to approach the EU project with appropriate focus while ensuring that our North American operations continued to thrive under experienced leadership. It also gave me space to think strategically about Bridge the Gap's long-term future, rather than just reacting to immediate opportunities and crises. The European pilot programs, launched in September 2023, each presenting unique cultural and logistical challenges. In Stockholm, we had to adapt to a social service system that was already highly developed, finding ways to complement rather than duplicate existing programs. In Rome, multi-generational family structures meant we needed different approaches to identifying isolated seniors. In Krakow, historical trauma from World War II and communist rule affected how older adults related to volunteer programs and government initiatives. Despite these challenges, the European programs showed promising early results. The Stockholm Hub developed innovative partnerships with local healthcare systems, providing volunteer support that helped seniors age in place rather than moving to institutional care. The Rome program created intergenerational activities that strengthened family connections while providing additional support for seniors who lived alone. The Krakow Hub addressed historical trauma through storytelling programs that honored seniors' experiences while connecting them with younger community members. The success of our international expansion culminated in an invitation I never saw coming. In March 2024, exactly 2 years after receiving the UN Achievement Award, I was invited to address the UN General Assembly's special session on global aging. Not as part of a working group or research presentation, but as a keynote speaker representing civil society organizations worldwide. Standing at the podium in the General Assembly Hall, looking out at delegates from 193 member nations, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to that moment. 5 years earlier, I'd been living in my childhood bedroom, trying to convince my family that delivering meals to seniors could become something meaningful. Now I was presenting policy recommendations that would influence how countries around the world supported their aging populations. My speech focused on the power of community-driven solutions and the importance of treating social isolation as a public health crisis that required coordinated responses. I shared stories from our programs in Ohio, Phoenix, Stockholm, and Rome, demonstrating how the same fundamental principles could be adapted to dramatically different contexts while maintaining effectiveness. The response was overwhelming. After my presentation, delegations from over 30 countries approached me about establishing Bridge the Gap programs in their nations. The Secretary General's office invited me to join a permanent advisory committee on aging and social isolation. Major international foundations offered grants that could fund global expansion for decades. But the moment that meant the most came during the reception following my speech. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. It was Marcus. Watching the UN livestream from my office, I owe you an apology. What you've built isn't just impressive, it's world-changing. I'm sorry it took me so long to see it. That evening, I called my parents from my hotel room overlooking the East River. For the first time in years, we talked not about my work, or their concerns about my career choices, but about how proud they were of the impact we'd created together. Because that's what I'd finally understood. Bridge the Gap had never been just my project. It had been built with the support, skepticism, love, and eventual pride of my family, even when they couldn't see where it was heading. Looking back now, I realize that their initial skepticism had actually been a gift. It forced me to build something stronger, more sustainable, and more impactful than I might have created if everyone had simply believed in my vision from the beginning. Sometimes the people who love us most serve us best by challenging us to prove that our dreams are worth pursuing. The months following my UN General Assembly address brought a level of global attention that fundamentally changed not just Bridge the Gap, but my understanding of what social impact could look like. By summer 2024, we were fielding inquiries from organizations on every continent, and the scale of potential expansion was both exhilarating and overwhelming. The first major challenge came from an unexpected source: success itself. The Australian Department of Social Services offered a $12 million contract to establish Bridge the Gap programs in 30 cities across Australia and New Zealand. Simultaneously, the African Union expressed interest in a continental pilot program that could eventually serve millions of elderly Africans facing social isolation in rapidly urbanizing societies. These weren't just consulting opportunities anymore. They were invitations to fundamentally transform how entire continents approached aging and community support. But they also represented a crossroads that would determine whether Bridge the Gap remained true to its grassroots origins or evolved into something entirely different. The internal debate was intense. Our board of directors, which now included former government officials and international development experts, was split between cautious expansion and bold global scaling. Some argued that we had a moral obligation to share our model as widely as possible, regardless of the organizational challenges. Others worried that rapid expansion would dilute our effectiveness and compromise the relationships-first approach that made our program successful. Lisa, now firmly established as executive director, advocated for a middle path. We don't have to choose between staying small and losing our soul, she argued during a particularly heated board meeting. We can license our model and training programs to local organizations while maintaining quality standards and our core values. This licensing approach became our strategy for global expansion. Instead of directly operating programs in Australia or Africa, we would partner with established local organizations, providing training, ongoing support, and quality assurance while allowing them to adapt our model to their specific contexts and needs. The first major licensing partnership was with Community Connections Australia, a Melbourne-based nonprofit with 20 years of experience serving elderly immigrants. Their director, Patricia Wong, had attended my UN presentation and immediately recognized how our volunteer matching system could address isolation among elderly Chinese and Vietnamese Australians who faced both language barriers and cultural disconnect from traditional social services. Working with Patricia's team taught me new lessons about cultural adaptation that went far beyond language translation. In Chinese Australian communities, the concept of accepting help from strangers carried different cultural meanings than it did in rural Ohio. We had to modify our volunteer training to address cultural sensitivity around family honor, develop recruitment strategies that worked within tight-knit immigrant communities, and create evaluation metrics that accounted for cultural factors affecting program participation. The Australian pilot launched in October 2024 with programs in Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane. Within 3 months, they were serving over 400 elderly immigrants, with volunteer retention rates that exceeded even our most successful North American programs. More importantly, the adaptations they developed, particularly around cultural competency and community trust building, strengthened our model in ways that benefited programs worldwide. The success in Australia opened doors we hadn't anticipated. The Singapore Ministry of Health invited us to consult on their national aging strategy. Japanese prefecture governments began exploring our model as a complement to their traditional family-based elder care systems. Even China's Ministry of Civil Affairs, despite their typically cautious approach to foreign social programs, initiated preliminary discussions about pilot programs in several major cities. But it was the African Union Partnership that would become our most transformative international collaboration. Dr. Amara Diallo, a Senegalese gerontologist working with the AU's Department of Social Affairs, had been following our work since the original UN presentations. She reached out in late 2024 with a proposition that was both ambitious and deeply personal. Social isolation among elders is becoming a crisis across Africa as young people migrate to cities for work, she explained during our first video conference. Traditional community structures are breaking down, but government resources are limited. Your community-driven approach could be exactly what we need, but only if we can adapt it to very different economic and social contexts. The African pilot would focus on 3 cities: Nairobi, Kenya, Accra, Ghana, and Dakar, Senegal. Each represented different challenges. Nairobi's rapidly growing informal settlements, Accra's mix of traditional and modern family structures, and Dakar's unique position as a cultural crossroads between Arab and sub-Saharan Africa. Unlike our other international partnerships, the African programs would need to operate with minimal technology, limited financial resources, and volunteer networks that might include people with limited literacy. We'd have to strip our model down to its absolute essence while maintaining its effectiveness. The development process took 8 months of intensive collaboration with local partners. We created simplified training materials that relied on oral tradition and storytelling rather than written manuals. We developed volunteer matching systems that worked through community elders and religious leaders rather than digital databases. We designed evaluation methods that captured impact through community observation and narrative rather than formal surveys. The African programs launched in June 2025, just 3 months before I would return to UN headquarters for what would become the most significant moment of my career. The preliminary results were encouraging. Over 800 elderly Africans were receiving regular volunteer support, and community feedback suggested that the programs were strengthening traditional social networks rather than replacing them. Meanwhile, back in the United States, Bridge the Gap had evolved into something I could barely recognize from its origins in Millfield, Ohio. We now operated programs in 43 states, served over 50,000 seniors annually, and maintained a volunteer network of more than 35,000 active participants. Our annual budget exceeded $18 million, and we employed over 200 people across North America. The organizational transformation required leadership changes that were both necessary and emotionally difficult. I stepped back from day-to-day operations entirely, focusing on international partnerships and policy development. Lisa took full responsibility for domestic programs, while Michelle managed our increasingly complex financial and administrative systems. We brought in Dr. Robert Chen, a former World Health Organization official, as our Director of Global Programs. This leadership transition freed me to focus on the work that had become my true passion, helping communities around the world adapt our model to their unique needs and contexts. I was spending 6 months a year traveling, working directly with partner organizations, training local leaders, and documenting the innovations that emerged from each new cultural context. The personal cost of this global focus was significant. I was 41 years old, had never married, and maintained few close friendships outside of work relationships. My parents, now in their 70s, worried about my isolation even as they celebrated my professional achievements. Marcus, who had become one of my strongest supporters, regularly reminded me that I was at risk of becoming the kind of socially isolated person our programs were designed to help. "You've spent 15 years connecting other people," he said during a family dinner in August 2025. "But when was the last time you made a genuine personal connection that wasn't related to work?" His observation was uncomfortable because it was accurate. I had built a global network of professional relationships and had impacted hundreds of thousands of lives, but I had somehow neglected to build the kind of personal community that I advocated for others. This realization led me to make another significant life change. I decided to spend the second half of 2025 working exclusively from the United States, focusing on reconnecting with the communities and relationships that had supported me from the beginning. I moved back to Ohio, not to my childhood bedroom this time, but to a small house in Millfield where I could be close to my parents and the seniors who had been part of our very first programs. Mrs. Patterson, now 85 and still receiving weekly visits from Jenny Brooks, became a regular companion for coffee and conversation. Tom Walsh and Mr. Rodriguez, whose friendship had been one of our earliest success stories, invited me to join their weekly poker game. For the first time in years, I was experiencing the kind of intergenerational community connection that our programs fostered for others. This return to my roots came at the perfect time. In September 2025, I received a call that would bring my journey full circle in ways I never could have imagined. The September call came from Secretary General Antonio Guterres himself. I was sitting on my front porch in Millfield, watching Mrs. Patterson tend to her garden across the street, when my phone rang with the familiar international number from UN headquarters. "Ms. Sullivan," the Secretary General's distinctive voice was unmistakable. "I hope you'll forgive the personal call, but I wanted to speak with you directly about something rather extraordinary." He explained that the UN was establishing a new, permanent position, Special Envoy for Global Aging and Community Innovation. The role would involve working directly with member nations to implement community-based solutions for aging populations, coordinating international research initiatives, and developing policy frameworks that could be adapted across different cultural and economic contexts. "Your work with Bridge the Gap has demonstrated that community-driven solutions can work at scale while maintaining their effectiveness," he continued. "We'd like you to consider bringing that experience to the international level, helping countries around the world develop their own versions of what you've built." The offer was staggering. A 5-year appointment with the resources to influence global policy on aging and social isolation, working with the most senior levels of government worldwide. It would mean relocating to New York, traveling extensively, and taking on responsibilities that would affect millions of elderly people across the globe. But it would also mean stepping away from the direct service delivery that had always been at the heart of my work. I would be writing policy papers instead of training volunteers, attending diplomatic meetings instead of visiting isolated seniors, managing international bureaucracy instead of fostering community connections. I'm honored by the offer, I told the Secretary General. But I need time to consider what this would mean for Bridge the Gap and for the communities we serve. Of course, he replied. Take all the time you need. But I should mention that the position comes with funding to establish a global fellowship program. You could train and support community leaders worldwide to develop their own locally driven aging support programs. It would be Bridge the Gap's approach, but scaled to reach every continent. After ending the call, I sat on my porch for hours, watching the quiet rhythms of small-town life that had inspired my work from the beginning. Jenny Brooks drove by on her way to visit Mrs. Patterson, waving cheerfully as she had for the past 6 years. Tom Walsh was helping his neighbor fix a broken fence, the same kind of informal community support that we'd systematized into our volunteer programs. That evening, I called an emergency meeting of our senior leadership team. Lisa, Michelle, Dr. Chen, and our board chair, Dr. Foster, joined me via video conference from their various locations. I shared the Secretary General's offer and my conflicted feelings about accepting it. This is exactly the kind of opportunity we've been working toward, Dr. Chen argued. You could influence global policy in ways that would benefit millions of people. The reach and impact would be unprecedented. Michelle was more cautious. The question is whether Rebecca can have more impact working within the UN system or continuing to develop Bridge the Gap as an independent organization. Both have advantages, but they're very different paths. Lisa, as always, cut to the heart of the matter. Rebecca, what do you actually want to do? Not what would be most impressive or have the biggest impact on paper, but what would let you do the work you're most passionate about? Her question forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding. Over the past 6 years, as Bridge the Gap had grown and evolved, I'd gradually moved away from the direct service work that had originally motivated me. I was spending more time in boardrooms and conference halls than in seniors' living rooms. I was writing grant applications and policy papers instead of training volunteers and building relationships. The UN position would take me even further from that direct service work, but it would also give me resources to support thousands of other people who wanted to do locally what I had done in Ohio. It was a question of whether I wanted to be someone who builds programs or someone who helps others build programs. I spent the next week visiting our original program sites in Ohio, talking with volunteers, clients, and staff members about what had made our work successful. The conversations reminded me that our most significant innovations had come from people who were closest to the actual service delivery. Volunteers who understood their clients' needs, community members who recognized gaps in our programming, seniors who suggested improvements to our approach. The insight that emerged from these conversations shaped my final decision. Instead of choosing between direct service and policy influence, I would try to create a position that combined both. I called the Secretary General back with a counter-proposal. I'd like to accept the position, but with modifications that would allow me to maintain direct involvement in community-level program development, I explained. Instead of being based full-time in New York, I'd like to spend 6 months a year working directly with communities around the world, helping them develop locally driven programs. The other 6 months would be dedicated to policy development and international coordination. The Secretary General was intrigued by the proposal. After consulting with his advisors, he agreed to a modified position structure that would allow me to work half-time as Special Envoy while maintaining my role as founder and international director of Bridge the Gap. The announcement of my UN appointment came in November 2025, almost exactly 6 years after I'd started Bridge the Gap in my childhood bedroom. The media coverage was extensive, but the response that meant the most came from my family. Mom and Dad drove down from Columbus for a celebration dinner at my favorite restaurant in Millfield. Marcus flew in from Chicago, bringing his wife Sarah. And their two young children, my nephew and niece whom I barely knew because of my travel schedule. I owe you more than an apology, Marcus said during dinner, raising his glass for a toast. I owe you an admission that you were right about something I couldn't see. You weren't just starting a charity or building a career. You were proving that one person really can change the world if they're willing to start small and stay committed. His words brought tears to my eyes, not just because of the recognition, but because they captured something I'd learned about impact and scale. Bridge the Gap hadn't succeeded because we'd aimed for global influence from the beginning. It had succeeded because we'd focused relentlessly on doing good work for real people, and that good work had eventually attracted the attention and resources needed for larger impact. The celebration dinner also included Jenny Brooks, Mrs. Patterson, Tom Walsh, and several other volunteers and clients from our original programs. Looking around the table at the intergenerational community we'd built, people whose lives had been transformed not by grand policy initiatives but by simple human connections, I felt more confident about my decision to maintain direct service involvement even as I took on global responsibilities. My first official act as Special Envoy was to establish the Global Community Innovation Fellowship, funded by the UN but administered through Bridge the Gap. The fellowship would support 50 community leaders annually to develop locally driven aging support programs in their own communities, providing them with training, resources, and ongoing mentorship. The inaugural class of fellows included Dr. Amara Diallo from Senegal, Patricia Wong from Australia, a rural health worker from Bangladesh who wanted to address senior isolation in farming communities, a retired teacher from rural Mexico who had developed an intergenerational literacy program, and 46 other community leaders from around the world. As I prepared for my first official trip as Special Envoy, a 3-week journey that would take me to fellowship sites in Kenya, Thailand, Peru, and Romania, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 years earlier, my family had questioned whether my charity work was pointless. Now, I was representing the United Nations in efforts to address one of the most significant social challenges facing the modern world. But more importantly, I had learned that the most meaningful impact comes not from the scale of your influence, but from the depth of your commitment to serving others. Whether I was training a volunteer in rural Ohio or advising a government minister in Geneva, the work was fundamentally the same: helping people recognize their capacity to care for each other and creating systems that support those connections. Standing in front of the United Nations headquarters that day in March, holding the Secretary General's Achievement Award, I had thought about my family's initial skepticism and how their doubts had ultimately strengthened my resolve. Now, as I prepared to begin this new chapter of my work, I understood that their skepticism had been a gift in another way as well. It has taught me that the most sustainable motivation comes not from external validation, but from internal conviction that the work itself matters, regardless of who recognizes it. The real victory wasn't the awards or the international recognition. It was the fact that Mrs. Patterson still received weekly visits from Jenny Brooks, that Tom Walsh and Mr. Rodriguez had built a friendship that enriched both their lives, and that thousands of similar relationships were flourishing in communities around the world because someone had believed that human connection was worth organizing, supporting, and celebrating. That's what I would carry with me as I embarked on this next phase of the work: the knowledge that every grand policy initiative and international program ultimately succeeded or failed based on whether it supported the simple, profound act of one person choosing to care for another. The first year as UN Special Envoy challenged everything I thought I knew about creating change at scale. Working within the international diplomatic system was vastly different from building grassroots programs, requiring patience for bureaucratic processes that could take months to achieve what we'd accomplished in weeks at the community level. But it also provided access to resources and decision-makers that could amplify successful local programs into national policies affecting millions of people. My first major assignment was developing implementation guidelines for the global initiative. for age-friendly communities that the Secretary General had launched following our working group's recommendations. This meant translating the community-driven approaches we'd pioneered into frameworks that could work within vastly different governmental structures, from the decentralized social services of Nordic countries to the centralized systems of Asian nations. The complexity was staggering. A volunteer matching system that worked perfectly in small-town Ohio required completely different approaches in densely populated Mumbai, rural villages in Guatemala, or the sprawling townships outside Cape Town. Each context presented unique challenges around technology access, literacy levels, cultural attitudes toward aging, family structures, and government capacity. Working with the Global Community Innovation Fellowship Program became my anchor to the direct service work that kept me grounded. The 50 fellows in our inaugural class were implementing programs in contexts I could never have imagined when I started Bridge the Gap. Fatima Al-Zahra, a social worker in rural Jordan, had adapted our volunteer training model to work with Bedouin communities where traditional respect for elders was strong, but geographic isolation created practical challenges. Miguel Santos, a community organizer in rural Brazil, had created an intergenerational program that paired elderly farmers with young people learning traditional agricultural techniques while providing companionship and support. Each fellow's program taught me something new about the universal principles underlying effective community care. Despite radically different cultural contexts, successful programs shared common elements. They built genuine relationships rather than just delivering services. They respected local knowledge and customs. They created mutual benefit for both helpers and those being helped, and they operated with transparency and accountability to their communities. The fellowship program also revealed something I hadn't anticipated. The hunger for this kind of community-driven approach extended far beyond aging services. Fellows began expanding their programs to address child welfare, environmental conservation, mental health support, and economic development. What we'd discovered wasn't just a solution to senior isolation, but a replicable model for addressing almost any community challenge through organized, mutual support. This realization led to conversations with other UN agencies about expanding the community innovation approach. UNICEF expressed interest in applying our relationship-building methods to child protection programs. The World Health Organization wanted to explore how volunteer networks could support mental health initiatives in communities with limited professional resources. The UN Environment Program saw potential for community-driven conservation programs that could simultaneously address environmental challenges and social isolation. By my second year as Special Envoy, we were fielding requests from 43 countries to establish national aging support programs based on the Bridge the Gap model. The scale of interest was both gratifying and overwhelming. We were receiving invitations to present our approach to parliaments, cabinet meetings, and national policy conferences on every continent. One of the most significant invitations came from Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, who had made addressing loneliness and social isolation a national priority. She invited me to spend 2 weeks in New Zealand, working directly with government agencies and community organizations to develop a nationwide volunteer network for senior support. We've watched what you've accomplished in North America and through the UN Fellowship Program, she said during our first meeting in Wellington. New Zealand has the resources and political will to implement this approach nationally, but we need guidance on how to maintain the community-driven essence while operating at governmental scale. The New Zealand project became a laboratory for testing whether government-sponsored programs could maintain the relationship-focused approach that made community-initiated programs successful. Working with Minister for Seniors Tracy Martin and a team of local community leaders, we developed a hybrid model where the government provided funding and infrastructure while community organizations maintained direct control over volunteer recruitment, training, and client matching. The pilot program launched in 12 cities and rural districts across both North and South Islands, serving over 3,000 seniors within 6 months. More importantly, the community ownership approach proved that government support could enhance rather than bureaucratize local programs. Communities developed innovations that government agencies alone could never have created. Maori elders in Rotorua created cultural storytelling programs that connected seniors with their heritage while providing companionship, while Pacific Islander communities in Auckland developed church-based networks that integrated senior support with existing spiritual and social activities. The success in New Zealand caught the attention of other governments struggling with aging populations and limited social service budgets. Canada's Minister of Seniors reached out about a national expansion of our existing provincial programs. The Netherlands expressed interest in integrating community volunteer networks with their established healthcare system. Even countries with very different political systems began exploring adaptations. Singapore's Ministry of Health initiated discussions about culturally appropriate versions for their ethnically diverse population. But it was an unexpected invitation from China that would become one of the most challenging and rewarding experiences of my UN tenure. Dr. Li Wei, director of China's National Committee on Aging, contacted me through diplomatic channels about a confidential consultation on addressing rural senior isolation in China's rapidly urbanizing society. Migration to cities for work has left millions of elderly Chinese in rural villages with limited family support, he explained during a secure video conference. Traditional family structures are changing faster than social services can adapt. We're interested in exploring whether community-driven approaches could work within our administrative system. The invitation to Beijing represented an opportunity to influence policies affecting hundreds of millions of elderly Chinese, but it also required navigating complex political sensitivities around foreign involvement in domestic social programs. After extensive consultations with UN leadership and the U.S. State Department, I was authorized to participate in a fact-finding mission that would explore potential collaboration opportunities. My 2-week visit to China in late 2027 was unlike anything I'd experienced in international development work. I visited villages in Sichuan province where elderly farmers lived alone in houses their children had abandoned for factory jobs in coastal cities. I met with urban planners in Shanghai who were trying to design age-friendly communities for retirees whose rural social networks had been disrupted by relocation. I consulted with social workers in Beijing who were overwhelmed by the scale of senior isolation in rapidly growing urban areas. The most powerful experience was visiting a rural village outside Chengdu, where local Communist Party officials had spontaneously created their own version of a volunteer support network for elderly residents. Without any knowledge of Bridge the Gap or international best practices, they had organized younger villagers to provide regular check-ins, meal assistance, and companionship for seniors whose families had migrated to cities. We realized that if we didn't take care of our elders, no one would, explained Chen Ming, the village party secretary who had initiated the program. The government provides some financial support, but what people really need is connection and care from their neighbors. Their informal system had many similarities to our trained volunteer programs: regular visits, relationship-building focus, community ownership, and integration with existing social structures. But it had developed organically from local initiative rather than external program design, proving that the impulse to care for isolated community members transcended cultural and political boundaries. Working with Chinese officials to document and potentially scale this village-level innovation required diplomatic skills I'd never needed in community organizing. Every conversation involved multiple layers of meaning, careful attention to political sensitivities, and complex negotiations about how to support local initiatives without appearing to impose foreign models on Chinese society. The eventual outcome was a joint research initiative between the UN, Chinese academic institutions, and local government agencies to study community-driven aging support in rural China. While we couldn't directly implement Bridge the Gap programs, we could provide technical assistance and documentation support for Chinese communities that were developing their own solutions to senior isolation. This Chinese experience taught me crucial lessons about cultural humility and the importance of supporting local innovation rather than transplanting foreign models. The most effective international development work involved learning from existing community strengths and helping people build on their own initiatives rather than importing solutions from elsewhere. These lessons proved essential when I was invited to address the G20 Social Ministers Summit in Buenos Aires in 2028. My presentation focused on the global evidence base for community-driven aging support, but more importantly, it emphasized the need for policies that supported local innovation rather than standardized program implementation. Every successful aging support program we've studied worldwide shares common principles, I told the assembled ministers. But they succeed because they're adapted to local cultures, built on existing community strengths, and owned by the people they serve. The role of government isn't to operate these programs directly, but to create conditions where communities can develop their own solutions. The response was remarkable. Ministers from 18 countries requested bilateral meetings to discuss potential collaboration. The European Union invited me to consult on their next framework for aging policy. The African Union asked for support in developing continent-wide guidelines that could accommodate the diverse social structures and economic conditions across Africa. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. During the summit's closing reception, I received a video message from Mrs. Patterson, now 91 years old and still living independently in Millfield with support from Jenny Brooks and an expanding network of community volunteers. "Rebecca, dear," she said, speaking directly to the camera that Jenny had set up in her living room, "I've been watching the news about your work around the world, and I wanted you to know how proud I am. But I also wanted to remind you of something. None of this international work would matter if you hadn't started by simply caring about people like me. Don't forget that the most important work happens one relationship at a time." Her message brought tears to my eyes and reminded me why I'd insisted on maintaining direct involvement in community-level work, even as my UN responsibilities expanded. The global policy frameworks and international conferences were important, but they only mattered if they supported the kind of simple human connections that had transformed Mrs. Patterson's life and thousands of others. As I prepared to complete my 5-year term as Special Envoy in 2030, I reflected on what we'd accomplished and what challenges remained. The Global Community Innovation Fellowship has supported over 250 community leaders in developing locally driven aging support programs across 89 countries. National governments on every continent had adopted policies supporting community-based aging services. The UN's framework for age-friendly communities had been endorsed by 156 member nations. More importantly, the approach we'd pioneered had evolved beyond aging services into a broader model for community-driven social innovation. Fellows were applying relationship-building and local ownership principles to address everything from youth development to environmental conservation to economic empowerment. What had started as a meal delivery program in rural Ohio had become a global movement for community-centered social change. But significant challenges remained. Many government programs still struggled to maintain community ownership while operating at scale. Funding systems often rewarded standardized approaches over locally adapted innovations. Professional social service providers sometimes resisted community-driven models that seemed to diminish their expertise and control. The work had also taken a personal toll that I was only beginning to acknowledge. 10 years of constant travel, high-stakes negotiations, and global responsibilities had left me exhausted and increasingly isolated from the kind of personal relationships that I advocated for others. At 46, I had achieved professional success beyond my wildest dreams, but had neglected to build the personal community connections that I knew were essential for human well-being. This realization led to my decision not to seek renewal of my UN appointment when it expired in 2030. Instead, I announced my intention to return to the United States and refocus on the direct service work that had originally motivated my career. I would remain involved in international consultation and policy development, but my primary focus would shift back to community-level program development and innovation. The announcement surprised many colleagues who assumed I would continue climbing the ladder of international influence. But for me, it represented a return to the values that had guided my work from the beginning. The belief that the most meaningful change happens through individual relationships and community connections, not through policy documents or institutional structures. My farewell speech to the UN General Assembly in December 2030 focused on the lessons I'd learned about scale and impact during my 5 years as Special Envoy. We often assume that bigger is better, that reaching more people automatically means creating more change, I told the assembled delegates. But what I've learned from working with communities around the world is that depth of connection often matters more than breadth of reach. One genuine relationship can transform 2 lives. One strong community program can inspire dozens of similar programs. One person who feels truly cared for can become someone who cares for others. The response was a standing ovation. But the moment that mattered most came afterward, when I called my family to share the news of my decision. Marcus, now a successful financial consultant who had incorporated social responsibility consulting into his practice, was the first to respond. "I'm proud of everything you've accomplished on the international stage," he said, "but I'm even more excited about what you'll do next. You've proven that one person really can change the world. Now maybe you can teach the rest of us how to do it too." His words captured something I'd been thinking about throughout my final months at the UN. The real measure of success wasn't the policies I'd influenced or the programs I'd helped establish around the world. It was whether I'd inspired and equipped other people to create their own positive change in their own communities. As I packed up my office at UN headquarters and prepared to return to Ohio, I carried with me thousands of stories of ordinary people who had chosen to care for their neighbors and had discovered that simple choice could transform entire communities. Mrs. Patterson and Jenny Brooks, Tom Walsh and Mr. Rodriguez, Chen Ming in rural China, Fatima Alzara in Jordan, Miguel Santos in Brazil, Dr. Amara Diallo in Senegal, Patricia Wong in Australia. Each of their stories proved the same fundamental truth, that meaningful change begins with one person deciding to notice and respond to another person's need. Everything else, the policies, the funding, the institutional support, only matters if it helps more people make that basic choice to care. Standing outside the United Nations headquarters for the last time as Special Envoy, looking up at the flags of 193 member nations, I thought about that family dinner 11 years earlier, when I'd first shared my idea for Bridge the Gap. My family had worried it was pointless, that I was wasting my time on something that wouldn't make a real difference. They'd been wrong about the scale of impact, but they'd been right about something more fundamental. The work was only meaningful if it actually improved real people's lives. All the international recognition in the world wouldn't matter if Mrs. Patterson was still sitting alone in her house on Elm Street, waiting for someone to remember that she existed. The real victory wasn't the awards or the policy influence. It was the knowledge that in communities around the world, millions of people were a little less lonely because someone had chosen to organize, support, and celebrate the simple act of caring for each other. That was the legacy I wanted to carry forward, and that was the work I was eager to return to. My final months at the UN involved transitioning my responsibilities to Dr. Elena Vasquez, a community development specialist from Colombia who had been part of our fellowship program since its 2nd year. Elena brought a deep understanding of both grassroots organizing and international development, having successfully adapted our model to work in post-conflict communities recovering from decades of violence. Her appointment as the new Special Envoy represented the evolution I'd hoped for, leadership emerging from within the global community of practitioners rather than being imposed from outside. The transition process revealed how much the international landscape for aging policy had changed during my 5-year tenure. When I started as special envoy, only a handful of countries had national policies supporting community-driven aging services. By 2030, over 90 nations had established funding mechanisms for local volunteer programs and community-based aging. Support had become a standard component of international development aid. More significantly, the conversation had shifted from viewing aging as a burden requiring institutional solutions to recognizing it as an opportunity for strengthening community connections across generations. Young people were increasingly volunteering with seniors not just out of obligation, but because they valued the wisdom, perspective, and friendship that intergenerational relationships provided. This shift was particularly evident in the digital innovation that had emerged from our programs. Tech-savvy volunteers in cities worldwide had developed apps and platforms that made volunteer coordination more efficient while preserving the personal relationships that were central to our approach. In Seoul, university students created a neighborhood network app that helped elderly residents connect with nearby volunteers for everything from grocery shopping to technology support. In São Paulo, a group of young entrepreneurs developed a platform that matched seniors with volunteers based on shared interests and hobbies rather than just geographic proximity. These technological innovations arose organically from communities rather than being imposed by governments or international organizations, proving that local ownership could drive innovation just as effectively as top-down research and development. The apps and platforms succeeded because they enhanced human connections rather than replacing them, using technology to facilitate face-to-face relationships rather than substituting digital interaction for personal contact. Preparing to leave. New York also meant saying goodbye to international colleagues who had become genuine friends over the past 5 years. Dr. Sarah Lindberg from Sweden had become a close collaborator and confidant, someone who understood both the professional challenges and personal sacrifices involved in this kind of global work. Maria Santos from Brazil regularly called to discuss programmatic innovations and personal struggles with maintaining work-life balance while traveling constantly. Our farewell dinner at a small Ethiopian restaurant near UN headquarters turned into an informal planning session for maintaining our collaborative relationships even as our official roles changed. We committed to annual meetings where fellowship alumni could share innovations, troubleshoot challenges, and support each other's ongoing work. We also discussed creating a research collaborative that could document and disseminate the lessons learned from community-driven aging programs worldwide. These conversations reminded me that one of the most valuable outcomes of my UN tenure had been building a global network of practitioners who shared similar values and approaches to community development. This network would continue generating innovations and supporting local programs long after my official involvement ended, creating a sustainability that no single leader or organization could achieve alone. The process of closing my UN office was emotionally more difficult than I'd anticipated. Packing up 5 years of research, correspondence, and documentation felt like dismantling a chapter of my life that had been both the most challenging and most rewarding period of my career. Among the files and reports were hundreds of letters, from community members whose lives had been touched by programs inspired by or connected to our work. One letter that particularly moved me came from James Kawika, a native Hawaiian elder who had been part of a volunteer program in Honolulu that adapted our relationship-building approach to traditional Hawaiian values of kupuna, elder, respect, and ohana, family connection. He wrote about how the program had helped him reconnect with his cultural heritage while building friendships with younger community members who were eager to learn traditional practices and stories. Your work gave us permission to value what we already knew, that caring for our elders isn't just about providing services. It's about honoring their wisdom and maintaining the connections that make us who we are, he wrote. We didn't need to learn how to care for each other. We needed support for organizing that care in ways that worked with modern life. His letter captured something essential about the approach we'd developed. It wasn't about teaching communities how to care for their members, but about helping them organize and sustain the caring impulses that already existed. Most communities had people who wanted to help and people who needed support, but they lacked systems for connecting those desires and needs effectively. The final week before my departure included a series of meetings with foundation leaders, government officials, and nonprofit executives who wanted to understand how community-driven approaches could be applied to challenges beyond aging. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation expressed interest in adapting our volunteer training methods for global health initiatives. The Ford Foundation wanted to explore how relationship-based programming could strengthen democracy and civic engagement. The MacArthur Foundation was curious about applying community ownership principles to environmental conservation efforts. These conversations reinforced my belief that what we'd developed through Bridge the Gap had implications far beyond senior services. The core principles, building genuine relationships, respecting local knowledge, creating mutual benefit, maintaining community ownership, and focusing on long-term sustainability, could strengthen almost any kind of social intervention. However, I also recognize the danger of trying to scale successful approaches too quickly or applying them to contexts where they might not fit naturally. My experience in China had taught me that the most effective international development work required deep cultural understanding and genuine partnership with local communities, rather than simple replication of successful models. This tension between sharing effective approaches and respecting local autonomy would continue to challenge international development work long after my UN tenure ended. The solution, I believed, lay in supporting local innovation and cross-cultural learning, rather than promoting standardized program models that ignored cultural and contextual differences. My final official act as Special Envoy was submitting a comprehensive report to the Secretary General documenting the lessons learned from 5 years of global aging policy work. The report emphasized that successful community-driven programs required 3 essential elements: consistent funding that allowed for long-term relationship building, training and support systems that maintained quality while preserving local ownership, and evaluation methods that captured the value of social connections rather than just measuring easily quantifiable outcomes. The report also included recommendations for future international development work, emphasizing the importance of supporting existing community strengths rather than imposing external solutions, investing in local leadership development rather than creating dependency on foreign expertise, and measuring success through community-defined outcomes rather than donor-imposed metrics. On my last day at UN headquarters, I walked through the halls where I'd spent countless hours in meetings, negotiations, and strategy sessions. The building represented humanity's highest aspirations for cooperation and mutual support, but it also embodied the bureaucratic challenges that could sometimes obstruct rather than facilitate meaningful change. As the plane descended into Columbus and I could see the familiar landscape of central Ohio, I felt a sense of homecoming that I hadn't experienced in years. This was where I'd learned the basics of community organizing, where I'd made my first mistakes and celebrated my first successes, where people like Mrs. Patterson and Jenny Brooks had taught me that the most important work happened one relationship at a time. Was eager to see how Bridge the Gap had evolved during my years of international focus, excited to reconnect with the volunteers and clients who had been part of our programs from the beginning, and curious about what new innovations might emerge, from bringing a global perspective to local community development work. The taxi ride from the airport to Millfield took me through neighborhoods where some of our first expansion programs had been established, past the community center where we'd held our early volunteer training sessions, and along streets where hundreds of meaningful relationships had been built between volunteers and isolated community members. Seeing these familiar places after years of international travel reminded me that sustainable social change required both local depth and global perspective, understanding how to build strong programs in specific communities while also learning from innovations and challenges in completely different contexts. The work ahead would involve integrating these 2 levels of engagement in ways that strengthened rather than diluted the community-centered approach that had made our programs successful. As I pulled into the driveway of my house in Millfield, I could see Mrs. Patterson working in her garden across the street, still independent at 91 with the support of volunteers who had become genuine friends over the years. Her continued vitality and engagement represented everything our programs aspired to achieve, not just maintaining people's physical health and safety, but supporting their continued growth, contribution, and connection to their communities. That evening, I called my parents to let them know I was home. Dad answered the phone, and I could hear the smile in his voice when he recognized mine. "Welcome back, sweetheart," he said. "We're proud of everything you've accomplished around the world, but we're even happier to have you home where you belong." His words reminded me that belonging, to a place, to a community, to a network of relationships that provide both support and meaning, was what our work had always been about. Whether we were serving isolated seniors in rural Ohio or developing policy frameworks for international implementation, the goal was always the same: helping people find and maintain the connections that make life worth living. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.